Hello, my name is Mark Hipwell and I'm a design interface manager working on High Speed 2. I'm not here to talk to you about trains or railways. Whilst I think they're incredibly important, I'm here to talk to you about active travel and public transport and why I think we need to invest in them now and increase our investment, because if we don't, we're going to end up in a future dominated by four-wheeled private vehicles. Now, before I talk about something that I'm passionate about, I'm going to talk about something that I love, which is bridges, because I'm going to purge this out of my system. I think they're pretty, I think they're gorgeous, and I love them very much. But I could talk for hours about bridges. So I've got this slide. We're not going to talk about it again, but just look how gorgeous they are. But what am I going to talk to you about? Active travel and public transport, and why I think it's important. For two reasons. Firstly, when society invests in public transport, it benefits everybody. Even if you don't use it, it's better for the planet, it's better for the economy, and they're more efficient modes of transport. Secondly, I live in Smethwick, just outside of Birmingham, and I'm pretty lucky when it comes to public transport. I've got two train stations, Smethwick Roll Street and Galton Bridge, and I've got Handsworth Booth Street just round the corner from me to get the tram, which is great. But I have first-hand experience of how frustrating public transport can be. The tram is brilliant, but we've only built one line since I've moved to Birmingham. We are building more, but it's taking a while. And secondly, when I get the train into work, pre-COVID of course, when I used to get the train into work, at 9 o'clock on a Monday morning, it's a cattle shed. On multiple occasions every month, I physically couldn't fit onto the train. So public transport has become a victim of its own success because people use the train so much more and those seats get snapped up really, really quickly. Now, before we go into too much detail, I wanted to talk about modes of transport and why we move around. In an ideal world, we're in a position where how far we're travelling should dictate what mode of transport we're going to use. You're not going to get a jumbo jet to get a pint of milk around the corner, or you're not going to swim to the next time you go on holiday to Spain or Italy or France. However, we found ourselves in a position in car-dominated city centres where this blue line for cars becomes much longer for shorter distances because walking can be unpleasant, it can be dangerous, and we build roads and then we add pavements. So we find ourselves in a position where it can take a long time. If I walk along the canal, it can take me 40 minutes to get into town. If I follow the roads and the dual carriageway, it could take almost double that with crossings. If we then look at the blue line going the other way with public transport, it can be expensive, it can be inconsistent, it can be unreliable. So we get ourselves in a position where that blue line becomes much longer either side. This causes us a problem. As you can see from my lovely pie chart that I definitely didn't draw myself, we find ourselves in a position where the vast majority of journeys we take are with cars, taxis, vans, so vehicles with internal combustion engines. Now, this varies a little bit depending on whether we're talking about long distance commutes, travel for business or pleasure, but largely speaking, it's between 70 and 80%. Now, if you're inside London though, where the provision for public transport is much greater and it's more reliable, if you turn up to the London Underground, you know that a tube's going to come along in a couple of minutes, that blue slice of the pie becomes much smaller. Now, why is it a problem that so many people drive? Maybe we're happy sat in traffic or sat in our own private vehicles and it makes us feel comfortable. There's two issues. Firstly, independence and the illusion of freedom, that when we get to 17, we get given the keys to our first car, and that means we have freedom, which is okay, great, but it's kind of artificially created. A society should allow young people to be able to move around. We probably maybe get the bus to school, we might get the train once or twice with our friends, but in reality, if you don't have a car, you can't really drive. Now, at the other end of that age, I've put a question mark because it varies depending on kind of your situation, but perhaps you're retired and you don't need to drive anymore, or perhaps medical conditions, or you can't justify the cost. Our public transport is not particularly accessible either. So if you don't have a car, it's very difficult to get around in society. The second problem when we have car-dominated city centres is the environment. As you can see from my graph, we've set ourselves collectively as a country a target to be carbon neutral compared to the year 1990 by 2050. We've dropped those emissions by about 30%, which is great, but we're halfway there and we're nowhere near halfway done, which isn't great. We're also in a position where the energy sector has done fantastic work, but the transport sector has done little to nothing to improve their behaviour. This causes us a problem because the transport sector is now the biggest offender when it comes to emissions. We are driving a lot more. So even though we might have electric vehicles and hybrids, and maybe we can be a bit smarter with car sharing, we're driving more, so it equals out. Okay, so why am I talking about that now? Well, it comes to part of the hashtag for the event, Insert Future Here. We need to start doing this now. It takes time to build trust in public transport. It takes time to build new railways and capacity into the system. And it takes time to change cultural and behavioural characteristics so that people feel like they can walk and cycle. And also, particularly, it takes time to build cycle lanes so that people feel safe cycling and actively travelling. We can't get to the year 2049 and then decide we need to get 60% of people out of their cars, which is a really important point. Because it's not about banning cars, it's about reducing that slice of the pie from 75% to 50% to 25%, so that we use the car when it's the appropriate mode of transport. Now, some people might say to me, if it's about emissions and damage to the planet, why don't we use shiny technology to solve our problems? Maybe we use electric cars or hydrogen fuel cells or autonomous vehicles because they're a bit smarter when they use the road. The problem with that is that a car space is still a car space. Using a car is still not an efficient way of getting around within a city centre. Secondly, these cars still create particulates around tyres and brake dust. So we find ourselves in a position that, with this slightly idealised picture that you can see behind me, even if we're generous and we say 1.5 to 2 people per car, we've got about 20 to 25 people. We need to get into a position where we're reallocating space to more efficient, smarter uses of transport. So if you look at the picture that you can see behind me now, we've reallocated one of the lanes to a cycle lane. One cycle lane, roughly half the width of a road lane, can transport 2.5 times as many people. So if you give it the same amount of space, you can get up to 4 and 5 times as many, which is really useful inside a congested city centre. This isn't just about making it nice and pleasant to cycle around. This is efficient, and it stops people wasting time stuck in traffic. Secondly, creating space for public transport such as buses. Yes, they might be quite big and they're the same space as 2 or 3 cars, but they can carry 20, 30, 40 people, and if you give them a bus lane, they're not stuck in traffic. So you build that resilience and that reliability within public transport so that people want to use them. So that you can go from picture beforehand with 20, 25 people at a push to fairly comfortably 50 or 60 people using this. It's good for the planet, it's good for efficiency, and those people that need to drive can do. Now, why am I talking about the environment? I'm talking about accessibility, I'm talking about access to public transport, and I'm talking about why we need to invest in it. Well, a big issue for me is that when we invest in cars and roads and city centres that are dominated by that mode of transport, we're effectively investing in and subsidising the mode of transport that is more likely to be used by those people that are well off. So if you're a homeowner, you're more likely to drive. The higher your gross income, the more likely you are to own a car. And owning a car is an expensive privilege and not a right. When we talk about driving being cheap, in reality, what we're talking about is the cost of fuel. We forget that we spent 20 grand on a new car 2 years ago. We forget that we have to MOT and insure it every year. We forget that we pay VD and new tyres. So we assume that when it costs us £100 to get the train from Birmingham to London and it's only 40 quid to drive, we aren't making a fair comparison. So when we support car drivers, we are supporting those who are more likely to be financially better off. And as I mentioned earlier before, when we invest in active travel and public transport, we're investing in everybody because it supports everybody, whether you use it or not, because it's either good for your heart, your lungs, or your mind. Now, what are we doing about it? Unfortunately, this is the depressing slide because we're kind of doing everything wrong right now. For the 11th year on the trot, we are freezing fuel duty, which is money that you pay on top of the cost of fuel. That costs us billions in lost revenue that could be spent on public transport. It makes driving more appealing and cheaper, so people are more likely to do it. We're in discussions right now about making flights even cheaper. We already artificially make flights pretty cheap, And then we're talking about supporting the aviation industry coming out of COVID, which I can understand why people want to do it from an economical point of view, but from a sustainability point of view, it's incredibly damaging. Getting a flight is 17 times more damaging than high-speed rail per mile. And thirdly, we're making public transport even more expensive. So we're increasing the cost of rail travel by 3.5%. So we're making driving cheaper, we're trying to get people back onto planes, and we're making public transport even more expensive. Now, the fourth point, I'm going to go into a little bit of detail because the number looks really big, but I don't really care about the money. The government can borrow money relatively cheaply, and right now, historically cheaply, and in some circumstances at negative rates. So they're kind of in a position where they can borrow pretty much what they want, and they can pay it back over a very extended period of time. But there's a whole conversation about how the government finds its cash to support these schemes. The problem that I have is the amount of money that they've committed to roads, which is 27 billion as part of the Road Investment Strategy 2 over many years, and creating 4,000 miles of new roads, upgrades and improvements. And then we talk about spending tens to hundreds of millions. It's completely different magnitude. We spend tens and hundreds of millions on public transport and cycle lanes. So our priorities are in completely the wrong place right now. What can you do about it? This is a positive slide. Firstly, petition your MP and your local politician because they are making commitments to get people to walk and cycle, and we need to turn it from commitments on paper and shiny websites to actual action. The West Midlands Combined Authority mayoral candidates have committed by 2030 to make half of the journeys in Birmingham walking and cycling. That is a huge challenge, and we can't just do it by asking people to walk a bit more and cycle a bit more. We need to spend money and invest in active travel and public transport to make it happen. Secondly, you can support these schemes when you get an opportunity. There are people driving these schemes forward. They are appearing locally, but they live and die on local support. There is a vocal minority of car drivers that tend to group together and push these schemes down. So if you support them, please do so. And if they don't quite give you what you need, get involved in the consultations and let your voice be heard around these schemes. Lastly, explore your local area. This is one that you could do this afternoon, tomorrow, next week. And I'm really guilty. I didn't do this before COVID. I now go walking along the canals around Smethwick and the parks on an almost daily basis to go and stretch my legs and get some exercise. Ditch the car once or twice a week on those short journeys. I'm not saying if you're going to Asda's and you're buying 60 kilos of potatoes that you shouldn't drive. I'm not saying that at all. But cut those short 1 mile, 2 mile journeys where walking will do you some good. Now, to finish on a positive note, I'm just going to leave you a couple of pictures of my cat. This is Supervisor Emily. We adopted her from the RSPCA. She's been an absolute joy over the last year thanks to COVID, and she keeps me out of trouble. I hope you've enjoyed listening to me talk about active travel and public transport and why we need to insert the future here so that in the future we aren't dominated by four-wheeled private vehicles. Thank you.